Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Sheckley, founder of Up Academy. I'm here today with Mark Metry. Mark is founder of Growcast, author of Screw Being Shy, host of Global Top 100 podcast, Humans 2.0, and a keynote speaker. Mark, thanks for your time today. I'm so excited to talk with you. I appreciate you being here.
Tanya, it's a pleasure to have me, and I'm super passionate about the education system and education in general. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I know high school wasn't the best time for you, and I'm going to ask you to share that story in a few minutes. But before we dive into that, I want to check in and see kind of how you mentally prepare yourself for talking about things that have been traumatic in the past. And I don't want to compare our situations by any means.
Yeah, of course.
I lost my daughter 4.5 years ago, and it's a story that I share when I speak a lot, when I'm on podcasts or talking with audiences. And every time I do it, I'm completely wiped out afterwards. I'm emotionally drained. So I'm wondering if you have any tips, or how do you prepare yourself for having those conversations and giving those talks?
Tanya, this is such a phenomenal question. It's something that I've been asking myself, and it's interesting because one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Screw Being Shy, is for many, many different reasons. But one of them was just like, I really like talking about social anxiety and shyness because it's one of the things that held me back from achieving my potential for almost a decade. And I know how painful it is for people who experience that. And so I wanted to write a book for that. But the other reason is because I honestly just wanted to sort of like seal a bow on this chapter in my life. And writing a book about it definitely for sure helped. And I feel like in some degrees, I think time, like you need time to be able to move past something. I also think like expressing something, putting it out there in the real world, and then being like, this is part of my story. I feel like it's better. But I think in regarding your question, I think I really experienced like the negative side effects of this when my book was coming out in March, like when the world was basically shutting down. But like at that time and a month before, I was doing like this whole like press run media. And so I was basically a guest on like every podcast. And I don't know how many podcasts I did, but I was a guest on maybe over like 100 podcasts in the course of like a month and a half. And so like there were literally days where I literally had like 10 podcast interviews that I was doing. And so after that, I definitely burnt out. I definitely felt what you said in terms of like that emotional exhaustion of telling your story. And so I honestly kind of feel like because I've written it down and it's like a book now, because I've been able to like share it literally hundreds and hundreds of times. I feel like in a lot of ways, a lot of like the deep emotions that I had tied to it are now sort of more comfortable. And when I'm able to tie it, I always talk about it in terms of me personally, my story, in the sense of like, like what happened was really terrible, but I mean, it's like a happy story after. And so I always try to like frame it at the end for good, but I know that they may not work with, every story. And so I think just like expressing it. And then also too, like, for example, one thing I've learned is before I do any kind of like podcast or something, I always try to like just take a break before what I'm doing. I try to never like jump into a podcast interview right away if I'm like doing something different. And I always just try to like take like some deep breaths or go for a walk or something and just like try to reset my brain. And so, yeah, it's difficult, but it's something that I'm like thinking about right now. I've had this conversation with a lot of people. And I think the reality is like, if you are, again, for my example, if you're like in this like industry, all the stuff that I talk about, it's going to be heavy sometimes, and I get people who email me and, who message me all the time and, tell me some pretty heavy stuff. And so that's always a reaction too. Right. And so like, I think the more you talk about your story, the more other people are going to come to you with their vulnerability, and that also can take a toll. And so I really think it's like an art. It's like a subtle art. It's like a finesse of like really being able to empathize with someone, but then also like having certain boundaries emotionally, not even with them per se, but with yourself and how you perceive people. And so it can be difficult, but and then I also think there's also like many factors too that like if someone's listening to this, they should take into account, whether they are whether they're like a certain person, they come from a certain culture, maybe they grew up in a certain area of the world where they may experience sort of emotions more heavily compared to like a different society that may not necessarily be that open with their emotions. And so I think it's also just like having that self-awareness too of like I know for myself, like I'm a very sensitive person, and so I always make sure to just like set up the right boundaries emotionally with myself, whether that comes with like other people and them reaching out to me, people that I don't really know, and their story, because I know that if I just think about that, I'll get like really sad and it'll be really heavy. And sometimes you need to do that, and so I think it really is sort of like a subtle art. It's a finesse. Maybe a year from now we can have this conversation again, and I could have a better answer for you. But it's something that I'm dealing with right now, trying to figure out. I mean, I'd love to hear your take on it. It's definitely challenging for sure.
Yeah. Well, I heard you say several things, that it somewhat gets easier over time. And the more you tell the story, a little bit easier that it gets to tell and to share. Also talking about, different cultures and knowing yourself and putting up those boundaries where you need to between your story and taking on stories of other people. Especially, if you're an empath, all of that emotion from others can really make an impact. And that becomes where, those boundaries and that self-care is really important. But also, like you said, it's, I found with dealing with grief and dealing with trauma that I really had two options, and I could curl up in bed and I could eat brownies for breakfast every morning, which I did for a while, in the closet, so my other kids didn't see me eating brownies, because that's a bad example. But I could do that, or I could take what I had learned from that experience and share it with the world and use it to help other people. And while it's the harder path, it's definitely the one that's more rewarding and makes me feel like the lessons that I've learned can be useful for others. And so that's, it doesn't help with the emotional part though. But thank you.
I love that. Not that, but the two options that you described, I think that's really true. And I think I think at the end of the day, it's just like, I don't know what it is, but I think, if you're experiencing this, it's just like you reach a certain level of pain where you just like whether it's due to desperation or what, but you're just like, I can't take this anymore. Like I can't keep doing this. And I know that's the way it was for me, but it can be really challenging, and it still is challenging, and the challenge never really ends. But if we can figure out better ways to manage it, then maybe, we can navigate it easier in our lives. But yeah, it's a major problem. And like the reality is that this is such a major part of life. And I never learned this, just like by any of the traditional education means. And yet it's such a central part, of your life. And it's so important. And, like just speaking with a lot of different kinds of people from different fields, from like doctors to psychologists to leaders, like this is such an important topic that people need to learn about, so that they can gain at least some awareness, some sense of, like they can learn tools, learn ways to improve, manage it in their life, because it truly is one of the biggest problems. And And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. But I do want to shift into more of the story behind all of that. And growing up in high school, you were shy, you were bullied, you didn't do well in school.
No.
And I'm going to have you share more of that experience with us. But you also created one of the top Minecraft servers and found other ways to really explore, the things that you love to do. So can you
Yeah.
share more of your high school experience with us and what that was like? And did you get credit for your Minecraft server?
Thank you for asking. No, I did not get credit for my Minecraft server. I wish. So, for me to tell you about high school, I have to go back a little bit. So, so basically, I'm a son of immigrants, and my parents, they came to America. They moved to the East Coast, and they came here with barely any money. We lived in like some small apartment building in like the inner city. And I remember basically like in elementary school around like third grade, entering third grade, my parents got better jobs and we moved from the inner city towards like a more rural town. And I remember we moved to this small town with like 5,000-6,000 people in it. And it was interesting place for sure. But one of the really unique parts about this place is that there was no like racial diversity whatsoever. And I for the most part, it was maybe me and maybe one or two or three other families in the entire town who looked different. And so I also remember this time in America, it was like post 9/11. And so if you were an Arab or if you were Middle Eastern, if you were Muslim, if you were, any of these categorical things, that's where you felt a lot of discrimination and racism. And so I remember just being a kid and being put in this environment where nobody physically looked like me. I wasn't accepted. I started to, face different things from bullying to racism, to mental, physical violence, threats, things like that. And so that was basically, my life from elementary school, maybe until the end of middle school, beginning of high school. And so the effects of this was that I remember at that time when I had just experienced this, I remember my mind looking back at it now. I remember my mind just like slipped into this mentality where I just felt like I could no longer be myself. And I just felt like everywhere I went into, I was always the outsider. I was always the person who was perceived as not good enough or less valued. Um, and so I was just the kid in the back of the classroom. I was the kid who had no friends, who walked around by himself, who sat by himself in the cafeteria, library, whatever, didn't participate, wasn't a part of any kind of groups, organizations, sports, anything like that. And so by the time I was in high school, this was mostly basically my identity. This was my entire life. This is what I had known. And maybe I would say I had like 1, 2, or 3 friends who I wouldn't even necessarily call them my friends, but they were people who I just like sort of tried to surround myself with so that people didn't think that I was a complete loser and a loner by just walking around. And so, yeah, that was my life. And in turn, I think starting from maybe about middle school, I started to discover the internet. And I remember just like using computers in my school libraries, at my library. And I remember just like discovering different things. I don't really remember anything crazy, but I also played a lot of video games too. And so I remember like discovering YouTube. I remember like watching YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff like early back in the internet. And I remember probably like video games were like one of the few places where I felt like I could connect. And I felt like I was such a loser in my real life. And the only way that I could connect with people was maybe through the internet and through video games. And so I played a lot of video games. I ended up starting like different YouTube channels where I would like record myself. I think one YouTube channel I had like 35,000 subscribers. And that was like my way that I tried to connect. And then eventually I found this game called Minecraft. I started this, it was honestly started randomly. I started this server, which is just like, it's just like a place where more than one person can play on this game Minecraft that's really popular. And so I just like discovered it, and I just kind of like Googled how to do different things, and people started joining, and I started to get better, started to like put in microtransactions, build out a website, do different things like that. I think like after a year and a half, we had like over like 5 million people enter our server. It was like some crazy thing. And it was just kind of random. And so, also at that time, I also remember, being able to basically become pretty financially independent, going from a place where my
Mhm.
parents, never really, had a ton of money, me never really seeing probably more than like $200, all of a sudden just step into like thousands and tens of thousands of dollars, and do like this awesome thing. Um, and so, yeah, I remember when I experienced that, that was quite interesting, because I had always thought in the back of my mind that like eventually one day when I go to college and I, do some kind of studying to get a job, at some company, and I, get like a good salary, then that's when my life will be good, and I'll be happy. It was a super weird feeling, because I think I was like 16 at the time, and I felt like I had already achieved this level of financial success of like what the world was like school and my path was trying to get me to do. But I felt like I had achieved that early, and it was doing something that I actually enjoyed. But I remember
Mhm.
all of a sudden feeling like super confused in my life, and just like asking myself, like, what is happiness? What is sort of success? And I had never really asked myself those questions before. And so, yeah, it was just like a really confusing time, that just sort of like had me wandering, not really understanding life, not really knowing what to do, feeling like even more of an outsider. Um, and so, yeah, it's quite interesting for sure. It's yeah, honestly, when I look back at it, it kind of feels like a movie, like a different chapter.
You accidentally built a server that attracted 5 million people, brought in thousands of dollars, and still didn't see yourself as successful, because it's just not what most of us as Americans are raised to view as success. I know me growing up, you grow up, you get a
Yeah.
job, you go work for a company. That's like what you do. And so I did that. I was like, well, now, what do I do?
Yeah, seriously.
um,
And I think the biggest thing is like, yeah, I think you said it right. I think, I had terrible grades at school. I was not athletic. I was not like one of those like drama kids. I was not a musical person. I was not a artistic person. And so I think in a lot of ways I feel like I didn't fit into any of these buckets that are sort of perceived as successful. And so I think in a lot of ways that helped me. And I think obviously that hurt me. I think it helped me because it almost just kind of felt like I was losing all of the time. And I felt like when I was just sort of like I was terrible at school, I was terrible at socializing, I was terrible at all these things. It kind of gave me a sense of like, okay, if I know I'm gonna fail, then like might as well just like do it. And I think a lot of people like have fear around that, and they're like, oh, I don't want to fail. But for me, it was just like I'm always a failure. Like I've been a failure my entire life. So let me just try to pull the trigger on this. Let me try to do that. Let me try to do this. And like the reality is before I had that successful Minecraft server, man, I think I had probably launched maybe over like 20 different like random websites. I had launched a Minecraft server before then that totally failed. I like was making apps and different kinds of websites, and I think every single one of those failed. But this was the one that like really succeeded. I mean, it's kind of random, and I just think it has to do a lot with like how I perceive myself, and it really just led me to like eventually discovering what it actually means to live a life that I'm proud of, a life that I'm happy. And yeah, I mean, the reason why I do it is because I'm trying to share this with whether someone who's older or people who are younger. Um, because there's so many of these things where, we're just told that, if we have like 1 million followers on social media, or if we have a certain amount of money, or if we have a certain kind of body that we saw on Instagram and all these different things, then we'll be happy and successful. And yeah, I mean, I just kind of feel like I'm just like I think for everyone, but I think I'm just like a classic sort of example for my generation in terms of like falling into that trap of trying to like gain money, fame, things like that. When in reality, I was just searching for sort of just self-worth. I had no self-esteem, and that's really what I was after. And so, yeah, it's cool. It's cool to be able to do these things now that I at least understand these things. It's always, I always have problems and it can be hard, but I've definitely learned a lot for sure. So I'm grateful.
Yeah. Yes, you have. And so you weren't a great student, but you were a great learner. You were really good at learning things, and you had what I'm going to call the freedom of failure, in that if you don't have any fear of failure, there's so much that you can do. And that's always the question, right? Like, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? And you kind of came at it from, well, I'm going to fail, so what can I do? Which still opens up that freedom to be able to do things. But despite not learning to be a good student in high school, you were still an amazing learner. And you've learned a ton, definitely about the internet, but also, about a healthy diet and adequate sleep, and how to feed your brain, and how to shift your biochemistry and overcome, what a lot of us call like the animal brain or the thinking brain, and how to turn off that fight or flight when you don't need it, and move into something else. So how did you discover these things, or how did you really become a good learner?
Yeah. So, for me, what really happened was, so I'm kind of feeling like this lost way in high school, and I go off to college and I'm 18 years old, and a lot of these things just sort of start clicking in my brain. And I basically start realizing that one, I have social anxiety, which I never knew beforehand. I, was never taught anything about mental health. And then I also just like started to look at my future, and I was, in college at that time studying computer science, which is something I really didn't want to do. And so I just sort of like entered in the space where I kind of feel like I hit rock bottom, where I just felt like a lot of, like, for example, like the video games that I was playing, a lot of like the junk food that I was eating. I just felt like a lot of that almost just like seemed numb. And I got to a place when I was 18 where I like gained a tremendous amount of weight. I was overweight. I kind of felt like I was seriously depressed for the first time in my life. I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. I couldn't go to sleep at night. My lifelong social anxiety kind of transformed into social isolation. And, for one of the first times in my life, I started to really think and like fantasize about like suicide, about not being alive. And I just felt like I was in a spot where I wasn't sleeping anymore. I just felt like I was in so much pain. And so eventually, I really reached this moment of rock bottom where I was seriously in so much pain, and I was basically on the verge of being suicidal, and really just like hitting this sense of desperation, where I was basically like, Mark, you've been living basically your entire life this way, and like clearly it's definitely not working. And I just reached a spot where I was like, if I don't change what I'm doing, I'm literally going to become a statistic in a bad way. And But then I also saw the reverse of that, and I also saw I also could be a statistic. Like, I could be a story that people one day are looking at, if I'm able to turn these things around. And so I kind of had like a really intimate sort of like emotional transformation moment by myself when I was suicidal, when I was 18, in this really bad spot. And that eventually um, gave me the foundation to just like start changing my life. And at that time, like I said, I had no idea what mental health was. I had no idea what like mindset was, what self-development was. I had no idea what any of these words that we use. And so the only thing that I was aware of was my physical body. And so I remember like standing in front of the mirror, and like realizing, having a moment where I realized that I was overweight for the first time in my life. And so sort of the next logical step was just like, okay, how do I lose this weight? And that led me down a rabbit hole of a lot. I won't get into it, but that led me down the rabbit hole of like really learning about the power of nutrition and food. And, I was just always sort of taught that, food isn't like, it doesn't really matter, but if you eat too much food, then you're just going to gain weight and you don't want to be fat. And that was my only understanding of sort of food and nutrition. But once I started to read books, this one book, for example, called Bulletproof by Dave Asprey, I basically just started to learn that like when you eat certain foods, or when you eat anything really, your body takes that and then it repurposes it and uses it to recode the rest of your body and your brain. It impacts your hormones, which then impact your neurotransmitters, which then directly lead to your brain, which then literally control what your brain is doing. And so I just fell down this rabbit hole of like, wow. And like, one of the most interesting things as to, maybe why I wasn't that good at school, for example, was I felt like whenever I was in a classroom, or especially when I was waking up early in the morning, I felt like I had no focus whatsoever. And I remember feeling like this even in college. But the moment I started to shift what I ate, I felt like I could finally focus for the first time in my life. It almost kind of felt like my brain turned on for this first time in my life when I completely stopped eating any kind of junk food. And I just started to eat just like whole natural foods, no chemicals, nothing like that. And I felt like my brain turned on for the first time in my life, which all of a sudden gave me like the energy and the cognitive awareness and the focus to then be able to direct that towards what I wanted in my life. And basically what I realized was that so much of my life had gone by, and I was, whether it was in a classroom or whether it was in a social situation, my brain simply just didn't have the energy to be able to be awake and to sort of execute some basic tasks. And so once I started to eat healthy, all of a sudden it felt like a part of my brain got unlocked. And once I started feeling that, then I started to tackle my social anxiety. And I started to do different like exposure therapy exercises of incrementally exposing myself to like random people. And there's like a whole thing I could get into if you want, but but yeah, that was really the first step, And so when I had that moment, I had like a very sort of slow, like common sense transformation where I was just like, okay, let me try to do that. Okay, let me try to do that. And I think, I started to understand the brain, the body, the mind from a more like systems perspective, which is like, for like my technology, computer science background. And so like once I started to think about it like that, software, hardware is your brain, software is your mind. And I started to read different books that really began to unlock a lot of sort of life. And it sort of enabled me to learn how to use my brain, which is something that I was never taught ever. And it's almost like once I got that, then all of a sudden I could learn and I could focus and I could do all the things that I wish I could have done earlier. Again, it's not because I was like some bad person. It's not like I was some kid who was like, screw school. It's just like, this was the environment that I happened to exist in, whether that was invisible or visible to the outside world. And it's just like so many kids are going through this today, like literally so many kids. And like, before COVID, I would, go around and I'd speak at schools all the time, mostly high schools. And I would just like see kids who literally were me, just like literally sitting in the back of the classroom. I can tell they have no focus and they're not tired. And like the teacher's like yelling at them, even though I can tell that, maybe it's just like their brain is malfunctioning and it's not working right. And so it's such a common problem. And it's one of those problems that's almost like invisible. And I think, in like with my book and with my podcast and all the things that I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to raise awareness about this stuff, because just because you don't necessarily face this problem doesn't mean that potentially millions of people don't, and it's just super important to sort of raise awareness, because it's an invisible problem that is hurting a lot of people. And there's a lot of people in our society that aren't getting the right help that they need because it's an invisible problem. So yeah, it's that's why I had to write this book. It's like literally such an important problem, and it's interesting. It's interesting. I've read a lot of books around this topic, and um, let's just say there's a lot of answers that need to be found.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's something that we don't teach. We don't teach mental health. We don't teach a lot about nutrition. Most schools, aren't teaching mindset or how your brain works or how to optimize your brain. And that's stuff that wherever you are in kind of the spectrum of how well we use our brain, I guess. You're talking about, yourself as a more extreme example, and you see those kids that are like you, but even those kids that are functioning well in school or are doing all the things they're supposed to be doing, like most of us can still benefit from understanding how nutrition affects our brain and how we can use food and use our environment and use our body and physical activity to impact and enhance and create more efficiency with our brain and the things that we do. And it's all stuff that's not really taught. You've got to go find it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I definitely think there's a sense of realism, like I remember having this conversation with a friend of mine who's a teacher, and I was saying like the same thing of like, oh, why don't they teach nutrition mindset in schools? And it's just like that's just not really very realistic, because most of the teachers don't know that, and so it's like a sort of re-education for almost everyone. And so, it is super interesting for sure.
Well, it's a much bigger problem, and it's something that as an elementary school we're teaching with our kids with growth mindset. With our handbook has a whole section on nutrition, and please send your kids to school with real food, like not I don't want to see packed full of candy and sugar. Like we're starting those conversations. But we're down to our last few minutes. And like I said, I do run an elementary school. And so I want to ask you one last question about elementary school. And if you have any memories or projects or teachers or things that stand out in your mind from being a positive experience from that time of your life.
Yeah. I remember in like 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, I remember somewhere around then.
They all blur together.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of them were like lost. I had to recover them. But I have this memory of me going to the Boston New England Aquarium. And it's funny because I actually just went there last week. But I remember just like seeing fish in the ocean. And I felt like that was like the most interesting world ever. And I remember after going there, I remember like my dad got me like these marine biology books, and I would just like literally sit there and I would just like memorize like all the different kinds of fish, and I would just like know them and like what they would do and all the craziest information about them. Then I remember going back to the aquarium with my family, and then just like being able to like identify like all the fish, and just like almost like falling in love with like a different world, because I felt like it was super unique. And so that's a memory that I have. And then I remember we went on like this trip, and like we could touch the sandfish, we could like touch like some kind of fish in like some touch pool ocean thing. Sure. And I just remember it was like the coolest thing ever. And I remember like ever since experiencing that, whether it was like me and my family went to the beach, or even I was just like walking around in like the forest or something, I always remember like I had like a sense of like adventure. Like I was always trying to like discover things. I was always trying to like look at animals and like organisms, and like look at other things that were alive and be like, wow, that's so cool. Like, how is that thing alive? So yeah, that's a memory that I remember. Have we gotten that one before?
Not that specific one, but it's pretty common that kids remember or adults remember field trips. And we know, like when we look at learning, it's when you change that environment that we're learning in, whether it's through a field trip or whether it's through experiential education, that's what our brain remembers. And in your case, it inspired you to dig a lot deeper and really look into a completely different world and learn a lot more about organisms, and really kind of fostered that interest and that love of learning, which is what they're designed to do. So,
woo, mission accomplished. That's awesome.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. This has been amazing, and there are so many more questions and things that we could dive into, but I don't want to take up any more of your time today. So I'm going to say thank you, and perhaps we can have another conversation at another point in time.
Yeah, Tanya, this was so much fun. Please let me know how I can support you and what you're doing with your elementary school and anything else. This was awesome.
Great. Thank you.